and only 35 men of the battalion were left to cross the river at the end. So here was very gallant leadership by our brigade commander. He was always referred to by General Urquhart as a broken down cavalryman, but as an infantry soldier fighting here, he was brilliant and very brave indeed. Our commanding officer and second in command were killed here about 200 yards to the left. Also two very fine soldiers. And to again, for temporary measure, the hotels down at the crossroads, the Schoonord and the other one on the opposite side, which I can never pronounce, and the Tafelberg, were taken over temporarily as dressing stations by the air landing field ambulance. And it was on the third day when the failure to get into Arnhem failed, and the effort to get into Arnhem failed, and the remnants of 3 battalions fell back towards Oosterbeek Church. And then at the same time, as I told you, the 4th Brigade, the remnants came through the woods and down through the woods over the road there, and came to here to get more weapons and ammunition and a bit of food and rest. So what became known as the perimeter formed here, not by plan, but because of the failure of the operations on either side. So when the general, realizing that, he said, right, I will form a bridgehead here based on the ferry on the river, which was then working. And I will await the arrival of 30 Corps, who were then in Nijmegen. But as I pointed out, the fatal mistake of our airborne corps commander was not to capture Nijmegen Bridge on the first day. It was still held by the Germans. So here is what known as the perimeter formed, consisting of about 3,500 men only, of which less than half were infantry. The other members were Royal Artillery, who were down by the Oosterbeek Church and fighting very well, and they were a magnificent lot of men. The rest were all arms and services of the division. And this was a point we made in airborne forces, and I hope they do in the rest of the army, that whatever arm or service you're in, you are first and foremost a fighting soldier, and you should be trained as such. And this is what they all had to turn to here, to be infantrymen. So the perimeter was formed, and as you probably all know, it was very narrow, and from the Hartenstein here you could see both the east, the west and the east side. The east side was down at the crossroads, and the west side was up by the roundabout. Very narrow indeed. 156 Battalion with some glider pilots and recce squadron took up a position about 200 yards north of this main road behind, and they were the northern part of the perimeter. Along the western side were the border regiment, who were largely intact. So in the north were glider pilots, engineers, recce squadron, 156, glider pilots, 10th Battalion, independent company, RESC, Royal Artillery, glider pilots, 11th Battalion, and so on. Really what, if you excuse me, what we call the bugger's muddle of a defence. And there they had to fight. And there was it was not a coordinated line. It was a series of small strong points, either in houses or in slit trenches, as it was mainly on the western side. And the battle went on here for 5 days. And gradually the casualties got higher and higher, from rifle fire, from snipers, but mainly from mortar fire and from artillery fire. And by the end of the battle, the Germans had about 110 artillery pieces firing into this area in addition to the mortars. One of the most feared weapons they had was called the naval Werfer, which is a 6-barreled mortar, and it fired in succession. And you could hear it firing in the distance, going pong, 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 like that. And everyone knew that 6 large mortar bombs would come screaming in here. A lot of the casualties were formed by mortar bombs bursting in the trees and the splinters coming down into the open slit trenches. So overhead cover had to be provided. There were about 250 German prisoners in the tennis courts at the back there. Now, General Urquhart has been criticized for going off on his own, and with Brigadier Lathbury being cut off from command of the division at a critical point. And that was difficult. He never said afterwards, after the war, what decisions he would have made if he'd been here the whole time. It is difficult. But anyway, by the time he came back, as I said, he realized, right, we must stand here. And I must say, and everyone says that it was his strength of courage, it was his leadership, which was partly due to this defense holding for 5 days. And as Brigadier Hackett called him, that indomitable fighting Scot. And those who got across owe much to him. And gradually, as I said, the casualties mounted till there were only about 2,500 men left. There was very little food. The casualties were mounting all the way around, and the dressing stations were on the perimeter. Schoonord was occupied by the enemy finally. The Tafelberg was occupied by the enemy. The casualties in there were either being killed or wounded again. And it was on the one last day that a truce was arranged by our head doctor, Graham Warwick, a very fine man, and not, as you may have seen it in the film, A Bridge Too Far. Anyway, a 2-hour truce was arranged, and quite a number of the walking wounded were taken from Schoonord. That's all. And then, on that day, General Urquhart passed the message over to 30 Corps. They were in communication then, more or less saying that those that are left are end of their tether, there is no food, there is no ammunition, any serious attack by the enemy will break through, we must be relieved in 24 hours. And that was when, or about the same time, that the generals on the other side of the river decided that the remnants must be withdrawn. There was no longer any hope of getting across the river. And the plan was drawn up on the other side of the river. It was brought over by Colonel of the Royal Engineers, and in about the space of an hour, General Urquhart here with his staff organised the plan. And he had studied the previous battle during the First World War of withdrawal, and he based his plan on that. And the plan was to what he called the collapsing paper bag, to start withdrawing from the north, and all the units on either side would come in here and move down. There were 2 routes laid out for the withdrawal, starting off at 2 rendezvous points. One rendezvous point was just behind you, the other one was just the other side of the Hartenstein. And from these rendezvous points, the engineers laid white minefield tape, and they were policed by